Hello, everyone. Thank you for the continuous support as always. And this is the devouring of a plague world.
Hesp had once been a green jewel in the dark. Before the galaxy was torn open and bled across the stars, before the Great Rift clawed its way through reality and left whole sectors screaming, Hesp had been catalogued in 100 administratum ledgers as a dependable jungle world in the segmentum obscurus. Its equatorial continents were smothered in dense, humid canopy, their crowns of foliage broken only by the silver gleam of rivers and the razor-lined scars of harvesting zones. Billions of imperial citizens had sweated beneath that green sky, stripping crops from the soil and fruit from the trees, feeding tithe quotas they would never understand, and a distant imperium that would never remember their names. Now the world stank. The air did not merely smell of rot, it was rot, given weight. Every breath was a swallow of damp corruption that clung to the back of the throat and crawled down into unwise lungs. Leaves that had once drunk sunlight now sagged under the weight of yellow, blisters and black cankers. Trees ballooned into obscene shapes, bark split and weeping, trunk flesh pulsing with slow, diseased heartbeats. The undergrowth was no longer earth and fallen leaves, but a mat of softened bone and half-dissolved bodies, all sinking, all merging, all feeding the next cycle of filth. In the wake of the Great Rift's birth, when warp storms howled and lesser men begged for deliverance, the Death Guard had come to Hesp. The Fourth Plague Company, known in dark jest and fearful prayer as the Wretched, arrived first. Their plague fleets did not descend in a glory of lance fire and orbital bombardment. They slid from the warp with the weary inevitability of a fever that has gone untreated too long. Their hulls were hulking warts of rusted ceramite and swollen growths, their engines coughing out clouds of flies and tainted light. Vox traffic vanished wherever they passed, blinded and deafened beneath a pall of psychic static and buzzing layered whispers. The Fourth were ruled not by a single mortal lord, but by a demonic plague gestalt, a sentient disease that had taken for itself the name Eater of Lives. Its will spread through the company in pulses of ecstatic agony, a constant background rasp in the minds of its favored, urging more infection, more summoning, more exquisite ruin. The warriors of the Wretched were marked by the Eater plague that coiled in their veins and bubbled beneath their pallid skin, their flesh as much a weapon as their bolters and rusted blades. They delighted in sorcery and the tearing open of reality, in defiance even of their gene-fathers' dour distrust of such arts. They fell upon Hesp like mould upon bread. The first gifts came unseen. Alchemical shells burst high in the humid air, and invisible spores drifted down like a second fouler atmosphere. Warp-tainted fogs coiled through the canopy, turning sunlight into a sickly, jaundiced smear. Water tables soured. Reservoirs grew a faint skin of green that thickened by the hour, hiding razor-fine tendrils that slid into mouths and nostrils and eyes. The populace began to cough, then to bleed, then to die. Those deaths were not an end. Most did not enjoy the luxury of stillness. Poxwalker herds swelled as the dead rose again, their bones creaking and their skins splitting under the pressure of bloated organs. They shambled through the streets and the fields, jaws yawning in mindless rapture, voices slurring through broken teeth in endless hymns to a loving, laughing god of decay. Others remained as they fell, their bodies collapsing inward, their innards liquefying and seeping down into the hungry soil. Whole hab blocks sagged as their foundations softened, rockcrete sinking like rotten fruit into a pit of its own juices. It was a beginning. Grandfather Nurgle loved beginnings. The Seventh Plague Company came in time, sailing on the same ill winds. Mortarian's chosen sons were different in demeanor from the Wretched. Where the Fourth gloried in demon summoning and warp filth, the Seventh took a chemist's pride in precise formulations and measured ruin. They were plague brewers and dark alchemists, their armor crusted not only in scabs and rust, but in sigils and measuring runes gouged into the metal with loving care. Their furnaces and macroalembics were as sacred to them as their bolt guns, On Hesp, the wretched and the chosen sons found common purpose. They did not speak of conquest. Hesp was not a staging ground for an advance deeper into imperial territory, nor a fortress to be held against counterattack. The world itself was the offering. Each continent, each sea, each cloud layer was to be shaped into something pleasing to their god, something that expressed his boundless generosity and humor. If other wars rose from this one, all well and good. If not, it did not matter. A single world, perfectly ruined, was a victory enough. The Vectoriums that took root upon Hesp were chosen with care. From the wretched came the Apostles of Contagion, a warband given over wholly to the creed of infection. Their master was Necrosius the Undying, a sorcerer whose mortal name had long since been discarded, whose flesh had swollen with unclean vitality, and whose soul was shackled to 1,000 pacts, best left unnamed. His psychic presence crawled across the plague fields like a film of slime, coaxing diseases into new shapes, teasing germs into hungry sentience. He saw the world as a blank canvas, and the eater of lives as the hand guiding his brush. From the chosen sons came the fecund ones, a Vectorium famed for the ruin of agri worlds. They knew how to unmake a food chain with surgical precision, where to apply each toxin and each parasite, so that the fall of a single insect would mean famine a continent away. Their alchemical lord on Hesp was Chem Lord Vardus Cole, a methodical artisan of death, whose mind measured genomes the way a master mason measured stone. To him, every enemy, species, was an unfinished masterpiece that required only the right disease to perfect. Necrosius and Cole stood together upon a rusted parapet, overlooking a valley that had once been a thriving plantation. It was difficult now to picture what crops had grown there. Whatever had been tended in the neat rows and terraces was gone, erased more thoroughly than any shelling could have managed. The valley floor was a soft, quivering mass of rotten matter, a stew of liquefied wood, meat, and soil. Fungal growths rose where trees had stood, towering columns of pale flesh capped with sagging caps, each dripping strands of viscous filth that hit the ground with soft, wet slaps. Ribs jutted from the morass like the hull frames of sinking ships. Faces slid in and out of view beneath the surface, eyes blind, mouths working soundlessly as gases bubbled through them. Sensor drones drifted over the mire, their bronze shells verdigrised and cracked, swinging chains and incense spouts. The fumes they exhaled were the heavy, sweet reek of half-coagulated blood and flowers left to rot in a sealed room. Below, poxwalker herds slogged through the muck, each step forcing grey and yellow slurry up around their swollen shins. They carried rusted poles capped with bells and tattered icons. Some bore cages in which the still living writhed, their skin peeling away in strips that hung from the bars. Billions had lived on Hesp before the plague companies came. The vast majority were gone now, their names and faces erased into a single, undifferentiated mass of useful filth. The few who endured did so because Necrosius and Cole wished it so. They were penned in holding pits cut from former habs, their walls now grown, over with lichen and scab. There, mortal bodies were dosed with carefully measured plagues, their suffering timed, their disintegration charted in loving detail. Thrall scribes and bloated servitors recorded the way muscle separated from bone, the way organs liquefied and slid through rent skin, the way screams changed as throats rotted. They hung time tallies and symptom boards beside each cage, marking the moment at which a subject ceased to be useful flesh and became part of the world's mulch. Necrosius watched the valley's slow motion writhing through the cracked lenses of his helm. The Death Guard warrior's armor had once been of sea-green ceramite, proud and unblemished. Now it was the color of mold and old bile, its surfaces bloated with vesicles and colonies of fungi. Flies crawled in the lenses of his rebreather, and horned growths pushed through the plates at his pauldrons, each weeping a steady trickle of pus. Runes of warding and binding had been hammered into the metal by rusted nails that passed straight through his corrupted flesh. He did not move as he observed. His presence was as still and implacable as a corpse. Cole spoke, his voice a dry rasp through vox grills slick with congealed phlegm. "The Eater is pleased." Necrosius felt the demonic plague's contentment like a low purr along his exposed nerves. The Eater of Lives did not speak in words. It was a pressure, a taste, a crawling sensation beneath the skin. It was the itch that could never be scratched, the hunger that could never quite be sated. On Hesp, it was strong. "The Eater is always pleased," Necrosius said. His words came slowly, as if pulled up through layers of syrup. "That is his nature, ever hungry, ever grateful, ever loving." Cole inclined his helm. His armor was a lighter hue than Necrosius's, a pallid, rotting bone color, stained in 100 places with chemical burns and spatter marks. Tubes and alembic assemblies clung to his pauldrons and backpack, some of them still bubbling, others clogged with scum. Glass vials dangled from chains across his chest, each containing a different shade of venom. "This world is receptive," Cole said. "The humidity, the biomass, the existing pest populations, the depth of the water table, all lend themselves to our work. The Seventh has unmade greener worlds than this, but rarely with such ease." "Ease is an illusion," Necrosius replied. "Effort is an illusion. In the garden, all things decay at the pace he wills. We merely watch." He did not say Nurgle's name aloud. There was no need. The god of rot and renewal was present in every bubble that rose from the valley, in every soft pop as a blister on a leaf burst, in every shuddering breath taken by the dying in the pens. To the Death Guard, Hesp was not a battlefield to be won and lost. It was a gift that was still being wrapped. Every dead man, every drowned forest, every collapsed hab block was another fold of stained paper around the offering. Patience was a virtue Nurgle instilled deeply in his favoured. All things rotted, given time. All things sagged and split. So long as there was moisture and flesh, entropy would eventually claw through even the proudest works of man. Time meant nothing to Necrosius the Undying. Cole, too, had long ago ceased to think in the spans of unaugmented mortals. They could have worked upon Hesp for centuries without boredom. Yet, beyond the sagging horizon, beyond the boiling cloud layers and the veils of spore fog, something moved. The astropaths died first. Even those pressed into service by the wretched, long inured to the caresses of demon whispers and the shrieking of the great rift, began to convulse and bleed from eyes and ears whenever they reached out into the warp. Some simply tore apart, their flesh unzipping along lines of invisible force, their ichor painting the walls in intricate fractal patterns. Others screamed until their throats ripped and their tongues burst, clawing at their own eyes as if something crawled behind them. Those deaths were noted, samples taken, patterns studied. Then the auger echoes began to warp. Vox ghosts howled through the rusted bridges of the Death Guard vessels, hanging in high orbit, a constant background mutter like a million teeth gnashing in distant darkness. Auspex stations reported phantom contacts that flickered in and out of existence, vast blotches of negative data that suggested presence not through a positive return, but through the absence of anything coherent. The psychers of the wretched, those who had not yet burned themselves hollow, felt it in their corrupted souls. It was not like the presence of demons or of rival sorcerers. It was not the crackle of the warp unleashed in fury, nor the slow, oily seep of some rival patron's attention. It was a pressure, a drag, a sense that something was pushing not from the warp into reality, but from beyond the stars into the warp itself, dimpling it like a heavy object resting upon thin cloth. On the rot-slicked parapet, Necrosius tilted his helm a fraction, as if listening. Cole's internal vox chimed with bursts of Binharic from his alchemical arrays, then with the more familiar, wet gargled cant of Death Guard shipmasters. Reports scrolled across his retinal displays in lines of green runes, noting astropathic casualties and augur anomalies in clinical detached language. "We are observed," Cole said. Necrosius made a sound that might have been amusement, though it was difficult to tell beneath the distortion of the vox and the bubbling of phlegm in his lungs. "Of course we are observed," he said. "The Imperium gnashes its rotten teeth whenever we touch one of its worlds. Some Crusader Lord has rallied his tattered banners, or some rival of our own seeks to steal a fragment of our work. Let them come. The Eater of Lives hungers for new palates." Cole bowed his head for a heartbeat, acknowledging the possibility. Imperial retribution was inevitable, in a cosmic sense, wherever the Death Guard worked too openly. Hesp was deep in the dark, in places where the Astronomican's light sputtered and failed, but even so, news travelled. Sooner or later, some crusade would lurch toward the coordinates, crammed with fanatics and fools eager to die gloriously. "We have plagues yet untested," Cole mused. "Strains brewed for the peculiar physiologies of unconventional prey. If rival warbands approach, their gene stock may prove instructive. If the corpse god's lapdogs come, so much the better. Their recorded reactions will please the Seventh's archives." Necrosius's gaze did not shift from the valley. To mortal eyes, it would have seemed that he ignored the threat entirely. Inside his helm, warp flame coiled along the scarred surfaces of his mind, tasting the currents that moved just beyond simple sight. "Prepare your sepsis cohorts," he said. "Call your engines to a state of eager decay. Whatever comes, we receive it as honored guests. The Fourth will weave the proper invocations." "Already begun," Cole replied. He signaled across the noospheric net to his subordinates, a series of curt, efficient pulses. In response, Manufactoria Cathedra began to roar louder. Distillation towers groaned as flow rates increased. Vats bulged. Sensor arrays spun up, their chains clattering like bone wind chimes. Poxwalker herds were redirected, shuffling in new patterns across the sludge. The disturbance grew, far above Hesp's choked sky, beyond the last wisps of spore clouds and the highest reaches of the planet's fevered breath. The void was not empty. Where mortal augurs saw only flickers and absences, something older and far more terrible than the Death Guard regarded the world. From the blackness between the stars, an armada advanced, not of steel, but of flesh. Enormous shapes swam through the void, accompanied by shoals of lesser organisms, their hulls a tangle of chitin plates and muscle strands, their prows bristling with feeder maws, tendrils, and living weapons. Hive Fleet Lotan had tasted Hesp. From a distance, the world's psychic scent stained the warp like a smear of oil on water. The Great Rift howled across the galaxy, but beneath that storm, there were still flavors for those that knew how to feed. Hesp was thick with biomass. Though much of it was already dead or dying, that mattered little to the Great Devourer. Flesh was flesh. Protein was protein. Bone, fungus, rotting plant matter, liquefied offal, all could be broken down and rebuilt in new forms. The very plagues that crawled through the world's tissues were nothing more than data to be harvested. Lotan's tendril turned, angling its course toward the jungle world. As it advanced, the shadow in the warp deepened, a crushing psychic pull that pressed down upon astropaths and sanctioned witches alike across the system. The lesser organisms that formed the vanguard sensed the rich reek of Hesp's atmosphere even before they breached it. Hungry minds, all facets of the one vast hunger, noted the alien volatility of the planet's air with a flicker of instinctive curiosity. It did not slow them. In the holds of the greatest bioships, Norn queens pulsed and brooded, their swollen forms shuddering with nascent designs. New adaptations coiled in their wombs, enzymes and countertoxins gestating, waiting for their moment. The hive mind's attention caressed the ruined world, unconcerned by whatever mortal infestations had already laid claim to its surface. There was meat here, in quantities enough to feed the hungers of an entire splinter fleet. The Death Guard looked up and saw only an approaching opportunity to test their most exquisite agonies. Hive Fleet Lotan looked down and saw only a world to be devoured. Between them lay Hesp, its jungles sagging and sighing, its rivers flowing thick as infected pus, its skies already choked. A place being slowly, patiently killed by one god's loving hand, now about to be seized in the jaws of another, altogether different terror. Hive Fleet Lotan had earned a reputation in Imperial records long before it ever turned. Its hunger toward Hesp. Where other tendrils of the Great Devourer hurled tidal waves of gaunts and monstrous bioforms straight into the meat of a world, Lotan worked like an infection creeping through a body. Recorded encounters spoke of worlds where the air had turned to acid before the first Hormagaunt clawed the dirt, where the clouds themselves had burned and eaten the skin of those who breathed them. Wherever Lotan descended in strength, toxicrenes and venomthropes came in ghastly profusion, their swollen sacs and whipping tendrils weeping poisons until whole continents resembled open chemical wounds. To humanity's terrified strategos, Lotan was not simply gluttonous, it was methodical. It turned planets into caustic digesters before the feast, stripping away all resistance with a slow, meticulous corrosion. High above Hesp's rotting jungles, as the first bioships of that fleet slid into the system, the Death Guard watched them come. The auger decks of the plague barge, blighted benediction, were sepulchral places of dim yellow light and constant buzzing. Conglomerations of flesh and rusted cogitation engines hunched together along the walls, their organ tubes feeding into trembling display lenses. Thrall crew, long since reduced to hairless, ulcerated wretches, shuffled between the stations on joints swollen with gout and rust. The air was thick with the smell of oil, sour sweat, and the never quite extinguished reek of old blood. Atypical mass signatures, droned the Vox officer, a huge man whose chest was a cage of iron straps holding in a permanently open wound from which pale organs pulsed. His eyes had long ago sloughed away. Brass lenses and clusters of fly eyes had been nailed into the sockets. Organic density suggests extragalactic xenoform configuration, consistent with previous encounters. Tyranids. The word carried no fear on that deck. If anything, there was a stir of something like interest. On a raised platform at the centre of the Auspex chapel, Lord Captain Galvost of the Wretched shifted his tremendous bulk, ceramite plates grinding against one another with a sound like tombstones dragged across stone. His armour was a mountain of bubbled metal and barnacled corrosion, bells and chains hanging from his gorget. A horn had burst from one shoulder pauldron and curled down around his chest, constantly weeping a thin trickle of pus. Tyranids, he repeated through his helm's vox. Again. There was history there, buried beneath that single word. Lotan was not the first Hive fleet to cross paths with the Fourth Plague Company. The Great Devourer had tasted Nurgle's plagues before and found them troublesome, though not yet fatal. The Death Guard had learned that the Tyranid hunger could be moderated, slowed, perhaps even diverted with sufficient disease. The Tyranids had learned that not all biomass was safe to consume. Signal the other ships, Galvos said. Form a defensive. Cordon, ready the plague torpedoes. We will greet our guests as befits favoured sons. Beneath his armour, worms of excited rot squirmed. Across the diseased void, other Death Guard cruisers rumbled into new positions, engines labouring as they pushed hulls heavy with centuries of accreted rust and growths. Pitted gun decks opened like sores forming on a corpse, their interior mechanisms coughing gouts of spores and flies as they ground toward readiness. Torpedoes were shunted into launch tubes by loaders that had once been servitors and were now little more than sacks of muscle and fungus bolted to iron frames. The vanguard vessels of Hive fleet Lotan glided closer. Silhouettes like cathedral spires of bone fused to the bodies of swollen sea creatures. Chitin plates overlapped along their flanks, glistening wetly as internal fluids pulsed beneath. Great feeder tendrils unfurled, questing for the first taste of the system's thin interplanetary dust. When the Death Guard fired, they did so with the ponderous confidence of those who believed utterly in the efficacy of their god's gifts. Plague torpedoes streaked from the blighted Benediction and her sister ships, their hulls sheathed in corroded ceramite, their guidance spirits shrieking litanies of joyous infection. They left trails of luminous, sickly vapor behind them, turbines coughing clouds of pathogen-rich exhaust. Alongside them lumbered spore warheads, bulbous things swollen with alchemical congestion, each one a carefully balanced ecosystem of virulent filth. They slammed into Lotan's outer bioships in a ragged volley. Some detonated on impact, blooming into clouds of oily smoke that clung greedily to organic hulls. Others burrowed in first, armor-piercing caps cracking the surface layer before discharging their interior payloads deep into syncytial flesh. Disease spirits that had slumbered in unreality stirred and stretched, pouring through the breaches in a tide of invisible teeth. 4 long heartbeats. It seemed to work. Where the plagues bit, the Tyranid vessels writhed. Chitin blackened and flaked. Patches of once flexible membranes stiffened and cracked, leaking strings of glistening, colorless humor. Organic cannon nests sagged and drooped as their muscle structures failed. In the dark between the stars, pale clouds of shed skin and sloughed flesh drifted like snow. But Lotan did not scream, nor veer away. There was no panic in the Great Devourer, only data. Inside those groaning bioships, whole forests of gland clusters and adaptive organs flared with activity. Toxin sacs swelled, burst, and reformed with altered contents. Bloodstreams thickened with new white components that were not cells, but specialized organisms in their own right, riding the flow to sites of infection and excreting counter-secretions. Muscle fibers darkened and hardened like scar tissue, forming in seconds. Where plagues chewed, enzymes answered, breaking down the diseases as ruthlessly as they would any other intruder. On the blighted Benediction, down in the alchemical galleries, Vardus Kol watched those reactions unfold. Scrying globes fashioned from the pickled eyes of astropaths and the crystal cocoons of bound warp larvae showed him magnified cross-sections of Lotan's hull flesh. Viridian runes sparked across the lower edges of his vision as his helm's cogitator spirits collated report after report from the auger decks and tox thresholds. "Strain, Golgotha," he murmured, more to himself than to the hunched data thralls crowding the workstations around him. Initial necrosis of exterior layers. Encouraging, but containment achieved within mere moments. His gauntleted hand tapped an icon formed of dried scabs on the console before him. The image shifted, zooming in on a patch of Tyranid hull where one of his prized gas strains was at work. Threads of viridescent vapor curled through pores and microfissures, hooking themselves into living tissue and spawning blossoming geometries of rot. For several breaths, the infection spread, fat and eager. Then it faltered. New fluids flushed through surrounding vessels. The color of the targeted flesh darkened from unhealthy yellow to a bruised, resistant purple. The plague pods shriveled, their geometric perfection collapsing into inert sludge. The vapor itself thinned and dissipated, leaving behind scars no deeper than the first few layers of tissue. "A remarkable immunological surge," Cole said, vox grinding with genuine admiration. "They learn as fast as we can teach. Excellent." One of his data thralls, a bare-headed wretch whose scalp was a mass of weeping sores, scratched a quill of bone across a sheet of dried skin, recording each observation in cramped, neat glyphs. His fingers shook with fever. Pus dripped from the knuckles and smeared the ink. Cole ignored the mess. Data was data, regardless of the medium. "Above Hesp," Lotan replied in kind. "The Vanguard bioships opened bulbous maws along their flanks, living cannons flexing and tensing as they extruded ammunition. Their shot was not metal, it was flesh and gristle and serrated bone, a storm of barbed organisms launched in spasmodic volleys. Living projectiles scythed through the void, tail fins adjusting as they felt the thin gravity wells of the plague barges. Some were simple spined slugs, meant to punch through armor and lodge within to detonate. Others were more complex, cluster organisms that broke apart into clouds of hooked seeds, each fragment hunting its own target. They struck the Death Guard ships in their turn. Rusted ceramite buckled and tore beneath the impact. Where the barbed slugs embedded themselves, they did not immediately explode. They unfolded, anchors of cartilage biting into hull metal, and began to eat. They chewed through corroded plating and into the swollen, half-organic guts of the plague barges, secreting acids that sizzled on contact with demon-infested cables and diseased flesh alike. Thrall crew shrieked as tendrilled growths pushed through bulkheads and sought out the heat of their bodies. Internal automated defenses spat out clouds of shrapnel and gouts of ghoulish promethium, burning some of the encroaching growth away, but not all. The first exchange in high orbit was not a thunderous, decisive clash of macro cannon and lance. It was a slow, grinding attempt by two different hungers to infect each other. Neither blinked. While ships traded diseases and living munitions, the greatest violence of that day came when Lotan opened its brood chambers and began the planetary assault in earnest. Mycetic spores fell upon Hesp. They came in waves, streaking through the planet's upper atmosphere as streaks of dull, smoking fire. To the mortal eye they resembled meteors, but the paths they traced were too deliberate, too coordinated. Each spore was a huge, fleshy seed pod armored in ridged chitin, its interior packed with living creatures cramped together in viscous slime. They hit the tainted air and began to burn, outer layers blistering and peeling. Internal life did not mind. Where they descended through clouds thick with Nurgle's caresses, spores soaked up the plagues like sponges dropped into foul water. Tiny mouths along their surfaces gulped at toxin-saturated winds, drawing data into the fleet's distributed awareness. The number of falling seeds was beyond sane calculation. Hesp's skies darkened under their descent. The already sickly light took on a bruised, mottled hue as shadow streaked across shadow. To those below, the rain of mycetic spores was a second atmosphere in motion, a storm of flesh that blotted out the diseased sun. They slammed into the jungles and the festering plains in explosive impacts that shook the mulch and sent waves through pus-thick rivers. Pods cracked open along pre-grown seam lines, disgorging their cargo with obscene urgency. Gaunts boiled from ruptured shells, talons clicking and scything as they fell into formation, their simple minds lit with the same insistent command: feed, kill, advance. Termagants, their living weapons fused to their arms, raised organic guns that drooled seed shot and toxin sacs. Hormagaunts bounded forward on powerful hind legs, clearing groves of tumor trees in a single lunge. Rippers poured out in seething carpets, each tiny worm thing little more than a mouth with a body attached, immediately turning on anything soft enough to chew. Larger beasts came too. Warriors clambered from pods like armored nightmares, their carapace ridged with the scars of far-flung wars. The air around some spores thickened and grew hazy as venom thropes floated out on their trailing tendrils, exuding curtains of choking, corrosive mist. In other zones, bloated toxicrenes heaved their bulk free, their crown of tentacles whipping and drooling streams of reeking, enzyme-rich slime that hissed wherever it fell. Hesp's surface convulsed under the shock of their arrival. The wretched did not wait to be overrun. On a ruined promontory overlooking one of the primary landing zones, Necrosius raised his staff. It was a length of dark iron that had once been a proud weapon of some loyalist champion, long since warped and inlaid with symbols that burned the eye. Dangling from its crosspiece were chains of teeth, rusted icons of Nurgle. and small cages in which skittered things that should never see daylight. At its crown was bound the skull of a psyker, eyes still twitching with trapped baleful sparks. Around him, the sorcerers of the Apostles of Contagion formed a circle, their armor creaking as they pivoted into the ritual stances hammered into them over centuries. The ground beneath their feet writhed with small worms, and the fingers of those interred there, reaching up in half-remembered devotion. Necrosius drew in a breath through ruined lungs, savouring the tang of Tyranid's spore washed thin, through Nurgle's fog. In the warp, the shadow cast by the approaching Hive fleet pressed down like a great black thumb on the skin of reality. To most psychers, that pressure was a suffocating horror. To Necrosius, it felt like resistance in a patch of infected tissue, something to be probed, squeezed, made to bleed. He spoke no consecrated high Gothic prayer. His words were a string of syllables that had never belonged on a human tongue, bubbling out of him in a stream of corrosive sound that ate at the air. His staff thumped down at the center of the formation, sending a crack spidering through the scabbed stone. Warp lightning crawled up the iron shaft. The cages rattled, their occupants hissing and keening. Around the circle, eyes set into the ground blinked open, the weeping sockets of corpses that had long ago been crushed into the valley's base. They rolled wildly, then fixed on the Tyranid swarm spilling into the jungle below. Fog rose. It came up from the ground, down from the sky, seeping out of the pores of the world itself. It draped itself over rotting trunks and the hunched forms of poxwalkers, coiling like a living thing. Where it passed over bone, it left a creeping patina of rust behind, as if time itself had sped up. Leaves drooped and snapped off their branches, falling as grey, weightless ash. Flame, where it met the fog, guttered and died, not through lack of air, but because the smell of the smoke offended something older. Out across the canopy, other sorcerous beacons flared. The Fourth Plague Company raised curtains of warp-tainted smog and pestilent storm fronts, sending them rolling to meet the falling mycetic pods. The sky became a hallucinatory landscape of clashing vapors, emerald veils sliding into bruise-purple thunderheads, streaked with bolts of sickly, yellow lightning that split the clouds open to reveal glimpses of tumor-slicked flesh beyond reality. The chosen sons answered with their own brand of welcome. In the artillery bastions of the fecund ones, Cole's alchemical shell cradles responded to his curt cant. Massive mortars belched roaring clouds of smoke and a rain of brass fragments as they spat plague shells into high arcs. Each shell was a miracle of hateful art, its interior divided into chambers of complementary toxins and engineered spores, its fused spirits coaxed into exquisite timing. They fell among the Tyranid landing zones as the mycetic pods burst. Where shells hit packed, gaunt formations, they erupted into expanding spheres of coloured mist. One went off in a bloom of rich, pancreatic green, its gas chewing at chitin with hungry hisses, turning hard armour soft and slimy. Another burst in a haze of pale, almost transparent fog that seeped into the mouths and spiracles of monstrous creatures and clothed their insides in choking mould. Some shells released flocks of invisible virus motes that rode on the spray of Tyranid ichor, turning every spatter from a wound into fresh contagion. Cole had designed each strain for a purpose. One targeted the iron-binding mechanisms in alien blood, leaving beasts weak and gasping as their oxygen transport failed. Another attacked synaptic nodes, chewing through the delicate tissues that linked lesser organisms to the will of their betters. A third aimed at the enzymes that broke down foreign toxins, seeking to overwhelm the very adaptation systems that made the Tyranids so troublesome. On the ground, where Deathguard and Tyranid met in earnest, cruelty blossomed. The first wave of gaunts crested a ridge of half-dissolved bodies and saw a wall of poxwalkers waiting for them. The herds stood shoulder to shoulder, their flesh hanging in strips, their jaws working in idiot devotion. Chains ran through the torsos of some, linking them together so they could not flee even if some twitch of former instinct told them to. Rusted bells swung from their necks and belts, chiming weakly with each unsteady shift of weight. Behind them, Death Guard legionaries watched. One, a plague marine whose name had been lost centuries before, rested the muzzle of his bolter on the crown of a kneeling mortal. The man was naked, save for the iron collar around his neck and the chains that ran from it to stakes in the muck. Dozens more like him stretched out to either side, a field of trembling, shivering meat, eyes wide and red with fear. "Observe," rasped the plague marine to the helot at his elbow, a scribe whose fingers had been replaced with syringes and quills. "We require timings." The helot nodded frantically, clutching a stained slate to his ulcered chest. A tiny clockwork engine clicked within the slate's casing, ticking off heartbeats. The gaunts hit the poxwalkers with the mindless force of a tidal bore. Scything talons cut into swollen bodies, opening them in showers of black and yellow filth. Termagant flesh-borer beetles burrowed into rotted torsos and burst out again in sprays of liquefied organ. Poxwalkers flailed and clawed, their fingers snapping off at the knuckles as they scrabbled at slick chitin. Some caught gaunts by the limbs and pulled them close, chewing with grinding teeth at alien flesh even as they were disemboweled. The air filled with the crack of bone and the wet slap of meat on mud. Gaunts did not hesitate. They leapt onto fallen poxwalkers and stripped them down to gleaming bone with their teeth, mouths making wet, eager sounds. Ripper swarms joined them, worming through heaps of corpses, tunneling into rib cages and gut cavities, emerging with tatters of meat hanging from them like dripping banners. The chained mortals were pushed forward at a gesture. Some tried to scramble back, heels digging furrows in the soft muck. Others had already collapsed, sobbing in snot-clogged terror. The Death Guard were patient. They let the chains tighten until the men choked, then eased them. Panic ensured movement. Those who vomited at the smell or the sight were beaten until they staggered upright again. They were shoved into the oncoming swarm. Gaunts flowed around them like water around rocks, then changed their pattern with eerie precision. A handful of mortals were dragged down beneath a tide of claws and teeth. Another was left standing for several seconds, flinching as muzzle-like mouths snapped at him from mere paces away, before a warrior strode up and casually punched its talons through his chest, pinning him against a tumor tree. Rippers boiled around his legs, gnawing his lower body away while his upper half still spasmed. Helot scribes timed each death with slavish diligence. They noted how long it took the Tyranid organisms to finish a victim, whether they removed bones or left them, whether they lingered over certain organs. They recorded the progression of any plagues that appeared to pass into the swarm through consumption, marking down when a gaunt began to stagger or when its carapace developed an odd sheen. On the other side of the slaughter, the Tyranids were no less clinical. Gaunts that collapsed mid-charge beneath the weight of some unseen infection were immediately swarmed by rippers, not for food, but for analysis. Tiny feeder organisms burrowed into their flesh, sampling the toxins at work and conveying that knowledge through biochemical relay to the nearest synapse creatures. Venomthropes altered the composition of their exhaled mists, thickening them here, adding counter-agents there. Toxicrenes dipped their tentacles into pools of particularly rich sludge, drawing up samples that would later be processed within their own bodies and relayed back to the Norn queens. In the opening clashes on Hesp, two unforgiving intellects spoke to each other not in words or in symbols, but in wounds and gas clouds and the speed of death. The Death Guard had expected to see enemies fall and stay fallen, to watch their plagues move through the swarm like a scythe through dry stalks. Instead, they saw organisms sag and falter, only for the next ranks to step over them with subtle changes in their internal chemistry. A gas that had swollen the first wave's organs until they burst seemed to do nothing more than irritate the eyes of the second. A disease that had eaten through chitin in bubbling lesions left little more than discoloration on the carapaces of those that followed. "This is new," Cole said, watching a magnified feed from one of his monitoring cherubs. The rate of adaptation, faster than previously recorded. He felt no fear, only the thrill that any artisan felt when an unexpected challenge presented itself. Necrosius, standing amidst his sorcerous circle, tasted it too. In the warp, the shadow of the Hive fleet did not simply press down. It rippled, a constant adjustment, as the Gestalt intelligence behind the swarm shifted its approach. "They learn," he murmured, almost in admiration. Then his tone hardened. "So do we." He widened, the invocation on his lips, bending the warp fog into new patterns, calling up strains of disease that had been born in the fever swamps of the plague planet itself. Plagues that had once eaten through Astartes' power armor, as if it were thin parchment. The fog thickened, taking on a greasy, clotted texture, rolling toward the advancing Tyranids in waves that left small, temporary vacuums behind them as they pulled air into themselves. Lotan answered. Glands swelled and burst in the underbellies of toxicrenes, flooding their tentacles with new enzyme cocktails. Venomthropes altered the priority of the chemical cues in their clouds, focusing now not just on blinding and choking, but on neutralizing specific volatile compounds creeping through the air. Carnifexes snorted and shook their heads as their nostrils burned, then snorted again, expelling bloody mucus that already contained the beginnings of defensive agents. From the heights of orbit down to the lowest, mud-choked gully, Hesp became a shared laboratory. Above, Death Guard ships hung in slow, cancerous motion, their hulls scabbed with Tyranid growths that they burned off with gouts of warp flame and chem fire, even as they launched more plague torpedoes. Bioships drifted on silent gravitic fields, their surfaces pitted with necrotic patches that slowly receded as new flesh grew to cover them, even as their living guns spat more parasitic ammunition. Below, the jungles of Hesp steamed and screamed beneath superimposed layers of poison. Nurgle's gifts and Lotan's counter-secretion washed over each other in intricate tides. Clouds of man-made and demon-birthed illness mixed with clouds of alien enzymes and pheromones until the very concept of clean air became a joke. Leaves blackened, then sloughed off branches that had already turned a sickly white. Rivers frothed with foam that was equal parts pus and digestive acid. Any mortal who stepped outside of sealed armor for more than a handful of breaths would have found his lungs turning into slough within his chest. No sane species would have run such an experiment. No rational mind would have chosen to stand on that world as it became a cauldron of competing plagues. The Death Guard slogged forward through the mire, coughing reverent litanies through corroded vox grills, eager to see which of their children survived. The Tyranids advanced with blind, perfect obedience to the will that controlled them, every collapse and grotesque mutation feeding back into a vast cold calculus that could never be satisfied. Hesp, once a green jewel, served as the dish upon which two hungers laid out their samples. The shadow over the world deepened. Hesp burned without flame. The fires that consumed the world were not the clean, bright pillars of promethium and plasma with which the Imperium liked to cleanse its mistakes. They were slower, thicker, crueler. They were plagues and toxins and corrosive mists chewing their way through, flesh and stone and soil in a devouring that did not roar, but bubbled. Once, tens of billions of humans had crowded the jungles and hives of Hesp. Once, every habblock and plantation had throbbed with the noise of unremarkable lives lived in ignorance of the wars that ruled the wider stars. That mass of humanity was now little more than memory and mulch. Their bodies had been broken down into poxwalker herds, into corpse piles, into a film of greasy meat clinging to every surface. Their bones had become scaffolding for fungus and rot. In their place came more life, if such a thing could be called life. The swarm fall of Hive Fleet Lotan did not truly end. The first planetary rotation after the opening bombardment saw mycetic spores slam into every major landmass and even some of the oceans until the seas themselves frothed with incubating flesh and the coasts were edged with bands of living foam that crawled up the beaches at low tide. Spores continued to rain down as the hours crawled by until the sky seemed a permanent bruise. The light between cloud and falling pods reduced to a sickly, intermittent flicker. Billions of Tyranid organisms bled from those pods in an unbroken tide. They spread like an ink stain through the steaming forests, a dark movement beneath the sickly canopy. Where once the jungles had rung with the calls of birds and the roars of beasts, now there was only the clatter of chitin on bone and the high, static shriek of a million alien throats calling to one another in a language of clicks and scents and synaptic pulses. Against that numberless advance, the Death Guard put forth a response that, in any other age, would have been the stuff of apocalyptic legend. The 4th and 7th Plague Companies committed their sepsis cohorts in full. From the Manufactoria bastions of the Chosen Sons, from the Shrine Pits and Charnel bastions of the Wretched, troop columns of Plague Marines and their support engines rolled out into the muck. Each sepsis cohort was a heavy fist of corruption, roughly the strength of a full Space Marine chapter, but swollen with instruments of disease rather than the pristine warplate and shining relics of their loyalist cousins. Plague-burst crawlers, their hulls shaped like hunched, deformed beetles, ground forward on treads choked with congealed filth. Their mortars thumped with sullen regularity, each shell a fat, hissing seed of ruin. Foetid bloat drones skimmed low over the treetops, their ruined turbines spraying clouds of spores and filth behind them, rusted scythes dangling beneath their bloated bellies. Myphitic blight haulers crawled in tight packs, their multi-barreled guns and missile pods crusted in verdigris and leaking pus. Between and before these engines trudged the true infantry of Nurgle's garden. Poxwalkers waddled and lurched in endless columns, their swollen limbs slapping against their own distended bellies, their mouths working in slack-jawed prayer. Chains ran through their torsos in tangled nets, binding them together so that even if they fell, they formed mounds for their fellows to clamber over. Here and there, greater shapes loomed among them. The hulking forms of corrupted hellbrutes and demon engines, their hulls cracked open to reveal twitching meat and demon eyes, chained to the march by rune-carved fetters. Behind that curtain of disposable flesh stalked the Plague Marines themselves. They advanced in loose lines, boots sinking to the ankle in putrescent slush, bolt weapons held with casual readiness. Their armor bells chimed softly with each step, their exposed innards pulsing in time with some unheard joyful dirge. Banner poles rose above their ranks, bearing icons of Nurgle fashioned from corroded iron and the skulls of former champions. From those icons hung chains of bones and cages in which Nurglings capered and shrieked with delight at the sights around them. Necrosius and Vardus Cole met again upon a rise of bone and hardened sludge as their columns shook the ground beneath. The rise had once been a habitation tower. Its foundations were still buried far below the surface of the rot, but only the upper levels remained above the seething muck, their walls eaten away and replaced with layers of fungus and clotted meat. Tumor trees had grown from the broken windows, their branches throwing a sparse canopy of blistered leaves over the parapet where the 2 Death Guard commanders stood. Below them, the opposing movements of Plague Companies and Tyranid swarms turned the jungle into something like the surface of a diseased ocean. Gaunts poured through the gaps between the trunks, disappearing in and out of view as they plunged through curtains of fog and chemical vapor. Ripper carpets rippled underfoot. Warriors stalked above them, carapaces slick with slime. Tyranid monstrous creatures loomed like living siege towers wherever the canopy broke. Against them, sepsis cohorts advanced in bands of rust and green, demon engines belching corruption, poxwalker herds breaking like filthy surf against the claws and teeth of the swarm. "Your plague engines march like pilgrims," Cole observed. The Vox distortion made his voice sound as though it were being dragged over gravel. From up here, it is almost touching. Necrosius's gaze tracked the line of one particular sepsis cohort, where it ground its way through a stretch of forest that had not yet fully collapsed. His thoughts were as slow and heavy as his gait, but they were no less sharp for that. Warp flames smouldered behind the lenses of his helm, and faint, twitching lights crawled beneath the corroded sigils etched into his shoulder plates. Pilgrims do not march into the mouths of gods, he murmured. They crawl. They abase. They beg. Cole made a small wheezing sound that might have been a chuckle. Very well. They advance like vectors then. A pleasing sight in any case. A spore cloud drifted over the rise, thick with the tang of Tyranid musk and digestive vapors. Necrosius tasted it through his helmet filters, analyzing by instinct what his artificers and observers confirmed in data streams. Their enzymes proliferate, he said. Our earlier gifts made them sniff and cough. Now they drink them. Expected, Cole said. They are the most efficient feeding mechanism this galaxy has yet produced. Their adaptation is their worship. Their god is hunger, and it blesses them with flexibility. Necrosius tilted his staff, scraping the tip along the swollen parapet. Rot shifted beneath the iron, revealing glimpses of bone and glass. And ours? He asked. Our God is love, Cole answered without hesitation, and he blesses us with time. They did not smile. Deathguard faces rarely remembered how. Then we give them time to learn the taste of disappointment, Necrosius said. We will not hold this world against them with bolter and blade, alone. That would be a crude, wasteful exercise in ego. Hesp is already dead. Its only remaining value is in what it can teach. Cole nodded slowly, the motion making the glass vials on his chest clink together. Within each, thick liquids of different colors sloshed, eager to be spilled. Agreed, he said. We have proven we can slow the devourer's appetite. We have not yet proven we can deny it entirely. Let this world be the experiment. We will make every mouthful a risk. We will teach the great devourer to fear the taste of rot. Necrosius turned his gaze from the seething jungle to the sky, where the faint silhouettes of Lotan's bioships glowed as darker patches against the filth-streaked clouds. The Eater of Lives hungers for a new kind of meal, he said, something that bites back. The pact was made without gesture or ceremony. Two ancient murderers agreed on an objective, and that was enough. Orders rippled down the comnets of the 4th and 7th Plague Companies, carried on vox echoes thick with interference and the occasional bubbling laugh of demonic intrusion. Sepsis cohorts adjusted their advance patterns, swinging wide to encircle key landing zones and choke points, drawing the greatest concentration of biomass into specific regions. Artillery bastions recalibrated their target priorities. Sorcerers rearranged their ritual circles. Most importantly, the virus bombs were brought up from deep storage. Unlike the neat, precision-engineered exterminatus shells of the Adeptus Astartes or the coldly impersonal life-eater weapons of the Imperial Navy, these were crude to the eye. They were enormous spheres of layered ceramite and bone, their surfaces rotten with engraved sigils of contagion. Tendrils of organic matter clung to their flanks, dripping pus and warp light, feeding spores inward to the volatile cocktails within. Each one throbbed faintly, as if it were an egg waiting to hatch. They were loaded into launch gantries whose machine spirits had been made to love disease. Curled demon faces pushed out of the metal, teeth grinding in anticipation. The warheads whispered to each other in a chorus of sibilant burbling as they were raised into position. Cole watched their progress from his command manifold, one gauntleted hand resting on a rail formed from fused spines. Necrosius stood beside him, silent, staff butt planted in a pile of skulls that had been left to soften in the humidity. Target the equatorial belts, Cole said, where the canopy is thickest, where biomass is densest. Allow the first wave of Tyranids to saturate those regions. Then, cleanse. Cleanse, Necrosius repeated, the word strange on his tongue. Yes, let us do that. The virus bombs fell like new moons. There was no fanfare to their descent. They did not burn bright. They fell heavy and slow, guided by cursed auspex and the murmured nudges of warp presences bound to their casing. When they struck, they did so with the kind of dull, concussive force that broke bedrock and turned hills into craters. There was no fireball. Instead, the casing split and peeled like rotting fruit, and the contents were released. Invisible clouds rushed out in all directions at once, more a pressure than a wind. Where they passed through foliage, leaves went from glossy green to brittle black in the space of a heartbeat, curling in on themselves as cell walls imploded. Bark split as the sap within trees turned to gas, bursting them apart in showers of splinters and hissing fluids. Vines and creepers fell from their perches, hitting the ground as strings of grey sludge. Animal life fared worse. Beasts that had once been proud predators of the Hespian jungles died mid-breath, their lungs liquefied, froth of blood and decomposing tissue bursting from nostrils and mouths. Eyes dissolved in their sockets, running down fur matted in sudden sweat. Muscles went soft, joints unhooking so that bodies collapsed into themselves like sacks of offal. Insects dropped from the air in a patter, wings rotted to tatters even as they fell. The Tyranids were not spared. Gaunts under the expanding clouds staggered, their movements going from fluid to jerky. Skin beneath their chitin blistered and peeled as tailored virotoxins found compatible pathways. Internal organs pulped. Some fell, their exoskeletons cracking as the pressure within turned to stew. Others remained upright, though their limbs twitched at odd angles, their claws dragging through the sludge as they tried, impossibly, to keep advancing. The virus bombs did not discriminate. Rivers turned to slurries of coloured filth as their waters became a medium for the plague, carrying it into every crevice and root. Lotan responded with its own kind of precision. From the upper hives of the fleet's bioships, new broods of toxicrenes and venomthropes were birthed in accelerated cycles. The Norn queens excreted new, adjustments into their vats, and the creatures that wrenched themselves free of their placental envelopes were subtly different from those that had fallen in the first wave. Where earlier, toxicrenes had been swollen with generalist enzyme cocktails, meant to break down a wide spectrum of native biota, these new monsters carried glandular arrays tuned toward neutralizing specific molecular patterns. Their trailing feelers dipped into virus-saturated muck and drew up filth that would have turned unaltered tissue to soup. On these, it merely ate shallow furrows that scarred over in moments. They reared up and vomited curtains of oxidizing acids across swathes of jungle, seeking to denature as much of the Death Guard's virotoxin as possible through sheer chemical brute force. Venomthropes floated low over the worst affected zones, their spore chimneys pumping out clouds of counteragents. Their mist did not heal, but it interfered, binding to viral particles and rendering many of them inert, even as it flayed exposed flesh and chitin alike. Around them, smaller bioforms exuded their own minor secretions, each adjusting the tang of the air a fraction, together creating microclimates in which Lotan's children could still operate. The ground became a battlefield, not of armies, but of invisible equations. The wretched's response was to call on the thing that ruled them. The apostles of contagion gathered in great circles across the equatorial belts, standing on islands of bone that were the only solid ground left in sagging stretches of liquefied jungle. Necrosius moved among them, staff leaving trails of smouldering corruption in the mud, chanting words that made the air thicken and curdle. The Eater of Lives was not a simple demon bound in some summoning circle. It was a gestalt plague entity, a sentient accumulation of 1,000 outbreaks, given will by endless suffering. On Hesp, where every breath was infection, and every drop of water carried a dozen different microscopic deaths, it was close to its ideal environment. Necrosius's rituals were not subtle. He did not seek to bring forth a single towering avatar or some grand dramatic manifestation that would stride across the landscape. He was greedier than that. He called to the microbial swarms themselves. He fed his own polluted soul into the chorus of bacteria and viruses, fungi and parasitic worms that already thrived on Hesp, offering them a unity they had never known. Under his guidance and the weight of his patron, disparate plagues began to sing in unison. Strains that had once competed for the same ecological niche found ways to coexist, one excreting the exact waste another required, forming stepped pyramids of infection. The Eater of Lives slipped into that harmony, a shadow in the interval between breaths, and began to teach. On a scale too small for mortal eyes to perceive, Hesp's microbial life took on patterns that were not their own. They developed a kind of predatory patience, clustering in ways that maximized the chance of exposure to Tyranid tissue. They flowed up trophic chains, concentrating in organisms that were most likely to be eaten by the swarm. They learned to burrow into chitin and wait dormant, invisible to the first sweep of Lotan's immune sense, only to erupt when their host was deep within the guts of some larger bioform. Death Guard sorcerers bled themselves willingly into those patterns, opening their veins and letting their already unholy blood spill onto the ground. The microbes that drank them took on aspects of warp energy, able to ride psychic currents as well as physical ones. Poxwalkers were driven in howling droves into Tyranid killing fields, their rotted bodies bursting like overripe fruit under the swarm's claws, spraying infectious slurry into every cut and joint. For their part, the Plague Marines embraced a more direct method. Cole and Necrosius both authorized what lesser minds might have considered an extravagance, the use of their own warriors as disposable bombs. Squads of Plague Marines presented themselves before the seething cauldrons of the 7th's Plague Manufactoria. Their armor was already pitted and swollen, but the alchemists and surgeons of the Chosen Sons set to work regardless, injecting fresh concoctions directly into their corrupted flesh. Vials were driven through ceramite and meat alike, emptying volatile strains into muscle and organ. Some warriors were cut open on the spot, their abdominal plates peeled back to allow the implantation of glass flasks thick with Nerglite reagents, sealed with plugs of bone and inscribed wax. The selected strains were unstable by design. Left unchecked, they would turn their hosts into sacks of pressurized filth that could not maintain cohesion for long. The Plague Marines knelt as they were worked upon, shuddering as new pains bent their warped nerves, laughing through vox grills choked with their own phlegm. Glorious, one gurgled, as a surgeon forced a writhing tube of necrotic worms into his chest cavity. Glorious. When they rose and sealed their helms, they did so knowing that every step toward the swarms was a step closer to their own dissolution. They trudged into the thickest masses of Tyranids, ignoring wounds that would have crippled even other Astartes. When claw and fang tore them open, the pressure within burst them like pustules. They detonated in showers of bone and metal fragments, each shard of themselves a blade crusted in hyper-infectious tissue. Clouds of diseased vapor exploded outwards, carrying fragments of their souls and the cackling delight of the demons bound to the contagion. Gaunts and rippers in the blast radius were flayed where they stood, the outer layers of their bodies stripped away in strips by the hail of shrapnel, their exposed tissues immediately seeded with an impossible density of microbial horror. Those that survived the initial blast staggered on, only to founder a few dozen paces later as their muscles spasmed out of control and their organs liquefied from the inside. Lotan, for all its pitiless rationality, was not gentle with its own. Creatures too heavily contaminated were cut off from the synaptic web and left to die where they fell. In some regions, the hive mind pulled whole broods back from the front, driving them into hastily grown pits of digestive biota, where they were broken down under controlled conditions, their tainted tissues rendered into their component parts and analyzed for useful mutations before being destroyed. In other areas, the Tyranids seized prisoners of their own. Thralls of the Death Guard, those rare mortals or lesser champions considered useful for observation, were torn from their positions in the line by monstrous beasts and dragged back behind the battlefront. There, beneath canopies sagging with sickly fungal growth, the hive fleet grew vivisection pits. Organic structures rose from the ground like obscene flowers, their petals formed of translucent skin veined with pulsing capillaries. Inside each, tendrils and feeding tubes hung like the roots of some inverted tree. Captives were cocooned within layers of mucus film, suspended in warm, nutrient-rich sludge that kept their battered hearts beating and their lungs filling, even as the rest of their anatomy was casually rearranged. Tendrils speared into chests and bellies, pushing organs aside to sample them. Bones were snapped and reset in new configurations to see how far the mortal frame could be warped while still providing viable meat. Brains were probed with delicate feeder filaments, not for information in the human sense, but for chemical memories of every plague they had endured. Those that survived the first days of such attentions did so in a state beyond any sane definition of agony, their minds stripped down to raw sensory input that washed through the Hive fleet's analytical systems. Their misery was not maliciously inflicted. It was simply a byproduct of thoroughness. The jungle itself protested as only a dying ecosystem could. Trees that had resisted the first waves of virus were not spared the combined assault of Tyranid digestion and Nurgle's exuberance. Trunks swelled and burst under the pressure of invading roots and tendrils, spraying the area with spore-filled sap that sizzled when it landed. Leaves turned from glassy black to a sickly, luminous white, then dropped in husks that crumbled into dust when touched. Rivers lost any last pretense of clarity. They became bands of multicolored effluvia, stratified by density and composition. On the surface, mats of congealed fat and fungal rafts drifted, clumping together into grotesque floating islands of rot. Beneath, currents of acid and digestive enzymes churned, their motion carving new channels through softened earth and undermining the roots of the last standing trees. The calls of native animals vanished. In their place came the wet gurgle of bursting bodies and the constant mind-numbing drone of insects that were themselves now little more than vectors for contagion. Even those insects began to die as the air passed a threshold where wings simply rotted off before they could beat more than a few times. Hesp's defining feature had always been its jungles, the vast belts of green that wrapped the equator and climbed over much of its temperate zones. Those belts became, within the span of a handful of solar cycles, a memory. In their place lay a sagging carpet of brown and grey and vile, bruised colours, all of it in motion, bubbling as gases formed and burst, heaving as things beneath shifted and drowned. From high above, from the observation blisters of the blighted Benediction and its sister ships, the Plague Garden's new state could be appreciated more fully. One basin in particular drew the eyes of all who cared to see. It had once been a valley, rich with farms and dense canopy. Now its edges were low, melting hills of half-collapsed soil and stone, studded with jutting ribs of rock and support structures that had not yet been completely swallowed. The basin itself was full to the brim with a thick, churning soup. In that vat, the difference between friend and foe, plant and animal, soil and flesh had been erased. Tyranid corpses floated as pale shapes, sometimes still twitching as residual impulses fired uselessly down half-dissolved nerves. Poxwalker bodies bobbed amid them, their jaws still working even as their lower faces slid away in ribbons. Clumps of fungus drifted like islands, their caps opening and closing in slow, obscene rhythms. Metal fragments from ruined tanks and crawlers protruded here and there, like the bones of drowned machines, their surfaces furred over with bacterial mats. The surface of the basin was not still. It heaved and sank in slow, nauseating pulses as subterranean gases struggled to escape, and unseen digestion processes worked upon the mass. Colours chased one another across it, swirls of green and yellow and sinister purple, each a different stratum of chemical reaction and microbial dominance. Lightning from the constant sickly storms that now circled Hesp struck the surface again and again, turning patches of it into momentary, hissing craters of steam and sending waves slapping against the basin's edges. The air above it was a shimmering haze of vapours that would have killed a mortal in breaths, so few they might as well have been counted on one hand. To Necrosius, staring down from a corrupted viewport, it looked like a cauldron. To Cole, analysing the toxin readouts, it looked like a proof of concept. To Nurgle, watching with boundless, bubbling affection from the heart of his eternal garden, it was beautiful. it was also only a beginning. The basin was a microcosm of what Hesp as a whole was becoming, a world-long stomach, a single vast organ bubbling with ruin. The Tyranids had come to feed. The Death Guard had come to spoil the meal. Between them, they were boiling a planet. The Imperium's answer to the Tyranids was always fire. When a world was marked for the Devourer, loyalist commanders spoke earnestly of sacrifice. They spoke of scouring all life from the surface, of turning oceans to steam and continents to glass, of denying the swarm even a single mouthful. Their catechisms framed this as nobility, as a hard and necessary purity. The Death Guard saw only waste. To them, worlds like Hesp were not numbers on a fleet chart or coordinates on a hololith. They were gardens, they were kitchens, they were cauldrons that would never boil if smashed too early. The Hive fleets did not frighten them as they frightened mortal admirals. The Tyranids were no apocalypse. They were gluttons. Gluttons could be taught. True victory over the Great Devourer was not measured in the number of its organisms slain. The swarm was infinite in practical terms, a tide that would always roll back in. No, true victory lay in teaching that vast, cold hunger that some food was not worth eating. If the hive mind could be forced to mark a world as poison, to steer away from it, then the Death Guard had not merely delayed it. They had scarred its instincts. Hesp would be that scar. Necrosius stood in a storm of filth and watched his experiment unfold. He stood on what had once been a plateau and was now a slab of fused bone and slag jutting from the endless, seething sea of rot that the equatorial jungles had become. The air around him was thick enough to chew, a stew of corrosive vapors, spores, and warp-tainted exhalations that crawled along the inside of his armor filters like eager tongues. Lightning crawled through the cloud layers overhead in colors that had no place in a sane spectrum. The Eater of Lives purred at the edge of his thoughts, a constant itch beneath the scab of his mind. "Not enough," Necrosius murmured to the unseen demon, to himself, to the world. "Not yet. They still feed." Below, Tyranid organisms surged and faltered across the sludge. Gaunts drove forward in waves that broke against mounds of corpses and into trenches of digestive mire. Monstrous creatures lumbered and staggered, their limbs dissolving beneath them, only to be replaced by fresh waves that came on through clouds of gas and lashings of plague. Even here, under a sky blackened with pollutant and spore, Lotan devoured. Necrosius turned from the ugly majesty of the scene and faced the circle of sorcerers kneeling around the plateau's rim. Their armor was half submerged in the heaving sludge, only their shoulders and horned helms showing above the surface. Their staffs were thrust deep into the meat of the world, runes burning along their length, mouths moving in muttered invocations. "We have poured plagues into them," Necrosius said, his vox carrying the words with grinding clarity. "We have clouded their lungs and curdled their ichor. We have turned their every step into a wade through poison. Still they eat. Still they learn." He raised his staff, and the world seemed to flinch. "Then we must stop thinking in terms of plagues and start thinking in terms of a plague. Singular. Entire." The staff's iron tip scraped against the ground as he walked to the plateau's center, where a crude map of Hesp had been carved into the fused bone surface. The continents were swollen and misshapen, reflecting their current state rather than their original geography. Rivers were shown as buckled, sagging trenches. The oceans were shallow bowls of half-solid sludge. Necrosius placed the staff at the map's heart. "We will not feed them pockets of corruption and hope they choke," he said. "We will make the world itself our offering. We will bind the atmosphere, the seas, the soil, every living microbe, every dead cell, to the Eater of Lives. Hesp will not simply be infected. It will be an organ of our god." The sorcerers murmured, some in awe, some in raw, hungry anticipation. None voiced doubt. The Death Guard did not balk at scale. Necrosius looked up as a new silhouette bulked through the haze. Vardus Cole approached across a causeway of congealed offal, his heavy armor sinking with each step. only to be buoyed up by unseen, eager things beneath the surface. The Chemlord's armor was festooned with new apparatus, coiling tubes and reinforced vats, their contents swirling in colors that hurt the eye. "You propose to make the whole world a ritual circle," Cole said, without preamble. "Yes," Necrosius replied. Cole's helm inclined as he considered. Within his armor, cogitator engines embedded in his spinal column and wrapped around his lungs ran endless calculations. Atmospheric volume, ocean mass, biomass, microbial density, warp saturation. All variables fed into the ravenous equations of his art. "It is not impossible," he said at last. "Difficult, beautifully difficult. The fourth will require the right shapes. The seventh will provide the correct reagents." "We will need apex plagues," Necrosius said. "Not simple killers. We must strike at their ability to adapt. Their learning has become the problem." "Yes," Cole agreed. "Their enzymes, their regulatory structures, the very mechanisms that allow them to alter their own flesh. We break those, and each swallow of this world becomes a game of chance they cannot afford." There was no triumph in his tone, only professional interest. The chosen sons set to work. Deep in the bowels of their plague manufactoria, vats older than the Great Rift's screaming birth awakened to new recipes. Colossal alembics, their glass long since gone opaque with etched sigils and internal scarring, boiled with thick, slow-moving concoctions. Swollen cherubs flitted between platforms on buzzing, diseased wings, adjusting valves and stoking furnaces with hands that dripped molten fat. Cole moved among his instruments like a priest among icons. He whispered to the vats, coaxing them to new combinations. He bled samples of Tyranid tissue into them, watching as his existing strains tore into alien enzymes and were themselves altered by contact. He designed plagues not to kill directly, but to twist. One set of strains targeted catalyst glands, those innocuous clusters of specialized tissue that allowed the Tyranids to trigger rapid metabolic shifts. Another family of toxins homed in on the molecular scaffolding that supported the Hive fleet's adaptive immunity, the structures that allowed immune responses to be encoded and passed on so swiftly. A third line of virotoxins sought out the copies of biochemical data itself, the small, intricate sequences that carried the memory of what had been survived. He intended for the hive mind to learn the wrong lessons. "Let them adapt," he said to his mute assistants, as they recorded each new formulation. "Let them write down our lies in their flesh. Every adjustment will lead them further from stability. They will become allergic to their own hunger." While the seventh brewed, the fourth built. Millions of corpses were dragged into motion. Poxwalkers waddled under the whips of plague marines and demon engines, each rotting slave dragging chains that were hooked into the meat of the dead. Human carcasses, Tyranid shells, Poxwalker husks, and even fallen Death Guard were piled together without discrimination. The mounds grew and grew, swelling into hills, then mountains. The corpse mounds were not left as mere dumps. Plague surgeons and warpsmiths worked in tandem to carve them. Great shafts were drilled through the heart of each mountain of meat and bone, forming chimneys lined with rib cages and jagged spines. Caverns were carved into the sides, their walls reinforced with fused skulls. Within those hollows, plagues and tallow were layered, coiled in strata that would vaporize at different temperatures, each releasing a different smoke. Around the base of each mound, sorcerers inscribed runes in lines of rusted iron and flayed skin, all converging on the central chimney. They hammered fetishes of Nurgle into place, bells and chains and fly-blown icons. They hung cages full of still living victims from the slopes, their blood draining in steady streams into gutters that fed the cores. When the sensor towers were lit, they did not blaze. They smoldered. Heat in their depths caused the inner layers to sweat, then boil, then sublimate. Smoke belched from the chimneys in thick rolling columns carrying with it a stew of viral particles, demon-birthed spores, and the oily exhalations of 1,000,000 cooked cadavers. That smoke spread across Hesp in bands, riding the wind and the warp both. It was not a simple cloud. It was a network, every sensor tower a node in a spreading web of ritual geometry. Necrosius stood before one such mountain as it began to work in earnest. He watched the smoke rise, eyes half closed behind his helm lenses, feeling the way it tugged at the already fraying skin between reality and the garden beyond. The Eater of Lives swelled. In the warp, the plague gestalt's presence grew denser, like mold thickening on bread. It seeped into the smoke, into the rivers, into the very heat haze that rose from the bubbling swamps. Insects that rode those currents began to show patterns of behavior no natural species would have displayed. They flocked where Deathguard needed them, biting Tyranid flesh in preferences that made no ecological sense. Hesp itself began to twitch. Lotan saw, in its own way. From the cold consciousness spread across its bioships and synapse creatures, the hive mind observed pollutant levels rising toward thresholds that, in other systems, would have triggered withdrawal. It noted the way adaptation gains were beginning to plateau, each new adjustment yielding diminishing returns. It detected anomalies in its own biochemistry, subtle deviations from predicted patterns in the enzymes and proteins of its freshly grown organisms. It pushed harder. More bioships slid into low orbit, cast in the lingering light of Hesp's dying sun as vast scars against the sky. Their behavioral glands pulsed, sending out torrents of new spores and mycetic pods. Fresh broods of toxicrenes and venomthropes descended in greater numbers, trailing clouds of counter-agents and digestive acids thick enough to strip paint from orbital debris. The atmosphere grew heavier, not lighter, under their efforts. Spore clouds mixed with plague smoke until it became difficult to say where one ended and the other began. Tyranid secretions sought to break down Deathguard toxins, but in doing so, created new compounds that the Eater of Lives happily claimed. Deathguard plagues chewed on Tyranid nullifiers and were themselves altered, becoming more entrenched, more cunning. On the ground, the hive mind turned particular attention to its test pits. In one such site, carved into what had been a fertile basin and was now a crater of slush, a pathway had been laid. At one end, the muck was merely lethal. At the other, it was something beyond that, a zone so saturated with overlapping plagues and chemical madness that even a plague marine would have dissolved to skeletal sludge within a handful of breaths. Between lay a gradient of horror. Lesser organisms were driven into the pit. Rippers, created in vast numbers for precisely such expendable purposes, wriggled forward in a churning carpet. The nearest synapse beasts drove them with barbed prods and pheromone cues, pushing them steadily through the spectrum of contamination. As they advanced, their bodies reacted, swelling, melting, frothing. Some simply popped, releasing clouds of vaporized tissue and escaped microbes. Others twisted into new shapes, mid-crawl, limbs sprouting, where there should have been none, mouths opening along their flanks. Those that survived to the far end did so as twitching, half-coherent lumps, their original forms unrecognizable. They were scooped up by feeder tendrils and fed back into processing organs in the bowels of the closest bioships, where their chemical stories could be read and rewritten. Above that pit, shadows moved that were vaster still. The sensor towers and test pits drew powers larger than plague marines and toxicrenes into contention. From one of Hesp's greatest plague basins, a shape began to rise. The surface of the stew bulged outward in a swelling hill. Bubbles the size of hab blocks burst, releasing geysers of black and yellow fluid. The roar of escaping gas shook rot from the sides of distant sensor mounds. Flesh, bone, rusted iron, and the remnants of once proud war engines were dragged upward, clinging to some invisible framework. A hand emerged. It was not a hand in the human sense, but a mountain of fingers. Each one a dripping pillar of meat and diseased fat, the whole attached to a wrist the size of a bastion. The fingers slapped down onto the shore, sending waves of slurry crashing outward. The smell that came with it was a weapon in its own right, a wall of perfume that spoke of graves left open and lard gone rancid on a stove. A head followed, a vast collapsing sphere of flesh with eyes like burst suns and a mouth full of rotting broken teeth. Horns curled from its brow, crusted with barnacles and barn-sized flies. Nurglings tumbled from its folds as it heaved itself upright, each tiny demon giggling madly as it splashed into the surrounding filth. A great unclean one had been born from Hesp's torment. It laughed as it came, a sound like 100,000 men drowning in their own blood. Across the battlefield, the ground tore open beneath the tread of something that dwarfed even that demon. A Hierophant Bio-Titan, one of Lotan's greatest weapons, forced its way through a curtain of half-dead forest. Its long, spidery legs stabbed deep into the sludge, each step driving it down to the hip before buoyancy and alien muscle dragged it free again. Its body was a hunched mass of chitin and flesh, studded with weapon symbiotes that pulsed and flexed. From its arched back grew living cannons that spat gouts of bioplasma and showers of quill-like projectiles. Another Hierophant moved beside it, slightly smaller, its carapace scored with the scars of other campaigns. Together, they advanced toward the great unclean one, their every stride collapsing channels of muck and sending spray fountaining. The daemon waded to meet them, belly dragging, rolls of corrupted flesh catching on semi-solid islands and tearing off in great hunks. Each piece that fell away wriggled and split, birthing lesser demons that crawled and flopped in its wake. The first exchange was brutal. There were no feints, no probing attacks. The Hierophants filled the air with bioplasma, bolts of incandescent shrieking matter that slammed into the great unclean one's body, burning tunnels through its tissues. Each impact blasted out showers of liquefied fat and clotted blood. Demon flesh sizzled, bones exposed and then dissolved. The great unclean one roared in delight and sloshed forward, swinging an arm that was more avalanche than limb. It caught the nearer Hierophant across its forward legs. Chitin plates shattered like porcelain. Alien bones snapped with sharp, dry sounds. The Titan staggered, one leg folding entirely, its immense bulk canting to one side. The demon leaned into the impact, pushing harder, forcing the creature down. It brought its other hand crashing down onto the Hierophant's back, fingers digging in and closing around carapace and internal organs. With a convulsive heave, it tore a section free. The Hierophant screamed, not with lungs, but with a psychic wail that rippled through the synapse web. Its internal fluids fountained into the air in streams of acid and nutrient-rich slurry, raining down to carve trenches in the surrounding muck. The great unclean one held the torn chunk to its mouth and bit, chewing noisily, pus and alien ichor running down its chins. Tyranid weapons tore more chunks from the demon in turn. Biocannons erupted, hosing it with streams of corrosive maggot clusters that burrowed into its belly and began to feed. It battered at them like a man clawing at fleas, pulling great handfuls of its own infested viscera free and throwing them, laughing at the second Hierophant. Where those gobbets landed, they detonated into clouds of virulent spores and gibbering minor demons that clung to the Titan's flanks, biting and vomiting in equal measure. It was a meeting of two forms of inhuman enormity, neither truly killable in any conventional sense. Each ripped pieces from the other, and in their struggle, the land between them was flattened, churned into a paste of every horror, Hesp contained. While giants tore at each other, the detail of the war shifted again. The presence of the Eater of Lives had thickened. It had sunk its figurative teeth into the lattice of rituals and censer smoke Necrosius had laid out, and pulled itself deeper into the fabric of the world. Plagues no longer behaved as passive agents. In the trenches and pits where gaunts and plague marines grappled, one could see droplets of slime change course mid-run. Blood from a ragged wound should have run down a Tyranid limb. Instead, It crept upward, crawling toward a joint, seeking entry. Wound channels did not close. They widened, edges fraying as unseen colonies gnawed inward. Death Guard watchers recorded instances where the fluid inside a dying beast seemed to ripple against gravity, flowing up and out toward the nearest exposed flesh, choosing hosts. In the brains of mid-ranked synapse creatures, clusters of infectious agents began to congregate in particular shapes, forming patterns that mirrored the fractal designs of Nurglite sigils. The Eater of Lives was attempting to hijack the Tyranid nerve web, to use their exquisite connectivity as its own circulatory system. The hive mind noticed. In some sectors of the front, organisms began to move with a half beat out of sync with the rest, their responses fractionally delayed or grotesquely accelerated. A Carnifex halted mid-charge and spasmed, its limbs jerking in parodic marionette fashion before it turned and fired its weapons wildly into its own lines. A brood of warriors stopped entirely, swaying as if listening to a song no one else could hear, then began to laugh in human voices that were not human at all. Such anomalies were rare, but they were intolerable. Lotan severed them. The synaptic links that bound those compromised organisms to the greater whole were cut like cords. The affected broods went silent in the psychic spectrum, isolated from the guiding will. Some collapsed where they stood, their bodies unable to maintain the complex dance of processes that kept them alive. Others thrashed on in place, flesh tearing itself apart under conflicting signals. Then the cleanup began. Bioships adjusted their firing solutions. Batteries that had been locked on Death Guard positions swung toward pockets of corrupted swarm. Bioplasma lanced down from the reddened clouds, washing entire square kilometers of battlefield in purging fire. The chemical composition of those blasts was subtly different from usual bombardment, tuned not simply to incinerate, but to break down warp-tainted residues, to denature the structures that the Eater of Lives had begun to build. Millions of Tyranid organisms died in those sacrificial strikes, their bodies breaking apart into clouds of ash, their valuable biomass wasted. The hive mind expended them without hesitation. It would rather starve for a time than allow a rival will to share its flesh. Above this all, Hesp's air thickened beyond any sane measure. Cole's cogitators spat out predictions and then stopped bothering. The numbers they produced became meaningless under normal frames of reference. Toxin concentrations in the atmosphere reached levels that would have slain lesser Astartes in moments. Plague counts per droplet of moisture climbed to figures that no human tongue could conveniently name. The ratio of breathable gas to corruptive agent fell and fell again, until the concept of breathing unaided became laughable. Even within the sealed armor of the Death Guard, alarms blared. Not alarms of fear, for those had long since been torn out or ignored, but alarms of interest. Pressure seals strained under the assault of corrosive fogs. Lesser modifications and weaker points blistered. Some warriors who had removed helms to better taste the air found their lungs liquefying in their chests. Even their blessed corruption, unable to cope with the torrent of hostile substance. They died laughing, choking on their own, disintegrating organs, sliding down into the muck to join the rest. Outside of armor, even plague marines would have been reduced to hollowed skeletons in a handful of heartbeats. The world was uninhabitable in any conventional sense. It was a place where air was acid, and earth was meat and water was poison. The sky rained spores and burnt marrow. The storms overhead crackled with warp energy and chemical fire both. Still, the Death Guard marched. Still, the Tyranids advanced. Hesp had achieved its apotheosis of rot, a planet no longer merely dying, but transformed into a shrine to corruption and a crucible for hunger. From orbit, Hesp no longer resembled the world the Administratum had once recorded in its ledgers. The greens and browns of jungle and soil were gone. In their place, coiled bands of color that had no place on a sane world. Great swirls of bruise purple and bile yellow and sickly green. Diseased clouds marched in belts around the equator, thick enough that their upper layers could be seen from the void as textured smears. The oceans were no longer blue. They had thinned into vast sheets of oily, opalescent slime, their surfaces streaked with scum in colours that spoke of rot and chemical madness. The orbit around Hesp was its own graveyard. Rusted hulks of Death Guard vessels drifted among shattered bioships, their hulls gnawed by Tyranid growths and scorched by chemfire. Here and there, demon-ridden wreckage tumbled, great slabs of metal and bone fused together by warp flare, trailing tendrils of ghost light and the thin screams of things half-born and aborted. Fragments of mycetic spores and torn Tyranid organisms turned lazily on themselves, leaking frozen crystalline trails of ichor that sparkled for a fleeting moment in the system's sick sun before sublimating into nothing. Within that ring of wreckage, a last ugly dance played out between the remaining plague barges and the shadowed silhouettes of Hive fleet Lotans, greatest vessels. Every exchange of fire shed more debris, more meat, more rusted shards to drift forever, a halo of scab around a dying world. The hive mind felt the tipping point. Across its gestalt awareness, red lines crossed unseen charts. Pollutant levels climbed toward thresholds that, in other war zones, had triggered withdrawal. Adaptive gains slowed, instability measures spiked. The metabolic cost of continuing to feed on Hesp approached margins that could not be justified by mere hunger. Yet beneath that cold calculus, another impulse roared. The Death Guard were attempting not merely to harass or delay the fleet, but to teach it. To imprint upon its vast biological memory the lesson that this world, and others like it, were lethal beyond any reasonable gain. Lotan would not allow the enemy to write within its flesh. The hive mind gathered itself and hurled its will downward. A final planetary push began. Bioships dipped lower in concert, skimming the upper atmosphere, their flanks bulging as they birthed forth torrents of fresh spores and mycetic pods. Tendrils stabbed into the cloud layers, vomiting concentrated broods of synapse creatures and toxin specialists, a last surge to seize or destroy the primary plague engines and ritual complexes before they locked the world forever beyond reclamation. Below, on the tortured surface, that final offensive fell upon positions already deep in their own endgame. One sepsis cohort of the wretched made its last stand in what had once been a manufactoria temple. The structure had been a vast cathedral of industry, a shrine to production and toil, its great arches carved with images of saints wielding hammers and spanners. Now, its walls were bowed outward, eaten from within by fungus and swollen meat. The vaulted ceiling had collapsed in several places, allowing the sky's diseased light to spill down in shafts that illuminated motes of spore and dust like swarming flies. The floor was gone. In its place lay a lake of corrosive slime, waist deep on a plague marine and rising. Plague-burst crawlers sat submerged to their turrets, their hulls hissing where acids gnawed at them. Dead-foated bloat drones bobbed and rolled, their turbines long since clogged with thick, choking paste. Poxwalker bodies floated face down or upright, buoyed by gas in their bellies, arms twitching weakly as reflex arcs fired without direction. Between shattered pillars and half-melted cogitator stacks, the surviving plague marines of the cohort held their ground. They stood in the slime like statues, boots sunk deep, armor sloughing from their frames in slow, dripping sheets. Where ceramite plates parted, rotted flesh bulged, held together by little more than scar tissue and will. Their pauldrons were peeled back in places, revealing swollen deltoid muscles riddled with pus pockets that burst whenever they raised their weapons. Bolters barked in steady, measured rhythm, spitting disease-tipped rounds into the oncoming swarm. Gaunts tried to cross the lake, their claws scrabbling for purchase on submerged debris. Many dissolved before they could take more than a few steps, legs thinning and tearing away as Hesp's concocted stew ate them. Others managed to clamber over the floating corpses, forming living bridges of twitching flesh as they threw themselves forward. Those were met with bolts that punched through their carapaces and burst inside them, turning rib cages into outward blossoming sprays of bone and offal. Tyranid spores and spines hammered down from breaches above, punching through the half-collapsed vaults to explode in bursts of razored chitin and burning ichor. Some plague marines disappeared under sudden, localized storms of teeth and bone, their armors punctured in a dozen places at once, their bodies torn to gobbets. The slime greedily pulled those fragments down and digested them. The Death Guard laughed. Their voices were wet, bubbling thick with their own obscenely liquefying lungs. Vox filters crackled with static and gargling that might have been hymns. One warrior, missing half his faceplate, showed bare teeth and a sagging cheek as he fired, his exposed eye filmed over with slime, tears of pus running down his cratered jaw. "Come," he croaked to the throng, whether he meant the Tyranids or his own end unclear. "Come, come, all of you. Drink." In another quarter of the world, a sepsis cohort of the Chosen Sons died in its own fashion. They held a ring of Manufactoria towers that had been converted into plague laboratories, their chimneys now the sensor towers that fed the world ritual smoke. Tyranid assault waves smashed against the lower levels, tearing apart rusted walls and stained glass windows alike. Warriors burst through processional doors sanctified to Nurgle, only to be met by torrents of chemfire that clung and burned through even their resilient flesh. Plague Marines here fought without the rubble, clogged grandeur of temples. They fought in corridors waist-deep in viscous runoff, between vat banks that had ruptured and flooded rooms with hissing multicolored fluids. They fired along gantries slick with mold and glass shards, backed by the constant subsonic thump of alchemical engines as they pushed themselves to lethal output. Their armor fared no better than that of the wretched. Plates bubbled and slumped under the combined assault of their own emissions and Tyranid counter-agents. Seals burned out. Helmets became ovens of poison, every intake a searing lungful. Some removed their helms to howl in joy as their faces sloughed, grinning skulls exposed for a few ecstatic heartbeats before even corrupted bones softened. In both places, and in 100 others, the sepsis cohorts did not retreat. They did not break formation. There was nowhere sane to fall back to. There was only the work and the end of it. It was that willingness to stand and drown that made possible the act that would finish Hesp. In the heart of his Manufactoria complex, Vardus Cole gave the command he had been delaying since the beginning. "Release the apex strains," he rasped, hands resting on the edge of his control altar. "Everything we have held in reserve, all at once." His assistants hesitated for the space of a breath, heads bowed, dripping, before scrambling to obey. Levers were thrown, seals were broken. Blessed wards of bone and rust that had kept the worst concoctions contained were smashed apart. Vats were opened either by carefully articulated taps or the simple expedient of detonating charges strapped to their sides. The crowning poisons of the 7th Plague Company entered the world. They rose as plumes, at first mere threads of darker mist within the already dangerous air. Then they thickened, retroviral toxins, tailored to seek out and rewrite the metabolic scripts of Tyranid cells, diffused into every current. Hyper-corrosive mists designed to eat. Not just organic tissue, but the supporting lattice of stone and steel, poured from broken conduits. Clouds turned black-green. Rain fell. Where that rain touched carapace, chitin did not merely burn, it sagged. Plates that had once turned lasfire and shrapnel alike softened as if they had been left too long in a furnace. Weapons symbiotes drooped, barrels bending, ammunition reservoirs leaking their contents as their enclosing tissues became brittle and cracked. Joints corroded, exoskeletal segments fusing together and locking. Gaunts tried to run and found their limbs had become heavy, dragging sacks of half-melted armor and flesh. Stone did not fare better. Hab blocks and rusted bastions that had withstood months of bombardment began to sag under their own weight, their cores crumbling as binding agents and reinforcing rods dissolved. Entire walls slumped like wax, taking with them shrieking mobs of poxwalkers and Tyranids both. Even the spent shells and twisted hulls of death.
Please support the channel and check out the link below for the best merch.
Guard engines were not immune. Plague burst crawlers dissolved down into their own tracks, turrets sliding sideways in slow collapse. Demon engines shrieked as their metal shells ran like tallow, exposing the screaming souls within to the open air before they too were washed away by the rain. Lotan's toxin specialists, the pride of its digestion arsenal, moved to meet this new horror. Toxicrines, their tentacles already swollen with countless previous chemical battles, slithered toward the worst affected zones. Their glands pulsed and bulged, secreting new enzyme cocktails as fast as their overtaxed systems could manage. They dipped feelers into puddles of black-green runoff, sucking up the fluid and holding it within their translucent sacs, internal tissues thrashing as they tried to break it down. Many swelled like overfilled bladders. The patterns within their glands went from purposeful to chaotic, receptors and catalysts alike overwhelmed. Some toppled, their tentacles flailing weakly. Their sacs turned cloudy, then opaque, twisting violently beneath their skin as incompatible reactions warred. One by one, they burst. They detonated not with clean explosions, but with wet, catastrophic ruptures. Their bodies tore open in ragged flaps, vomiting gouts of mixed toxin and partially digested plague into the air. The resulting clouds were worse than either substance alone, a stew of chemicals that even the hive mind had not predicted. Gaunts and warriors caught in the fallout simply came apart, layers of tissue peeling away from one another, as if they no longer recognized their own adhesion. Venom thropes floated through the rain, their mist vents churning, exuding increasingly complex fogs in last-ditch attempts to counteract the apex plagues. Their own bodies suffered for it. The delicate structures that allowed them to hover began to corrode under the backwash. Some sagged toward the ground, tendrils dragging until they hit the sludge and were swallowed. Others swelled in uneven fashion, their chimneys ballooning, then venting out one final enormous burst of mixed vapor before collapsing into limp heaps. The air above Hesp lost what little right it had left to be called air. It was then that Necrosius finished the last syllable of the longest ritual he had ever attempted. He stood at the center of the world, or as close to it as the geography would allow, atop a plateau carved from fused bone and rusted iron, where lines of power drawn from every sensor tower and plague engine converged. Around him lay the smoking stumps of sacrificial altars, their surfaces slick with blood and other less nameable fluids. The circle of sorcerers that had begun the work with him was much diminished, many of its members having burst, burned, or simply melted under the strain of channeling the planet's agony. Necrosius's own armor was a ruin. Whole sections had sloughed away, revealing a torso of corrupted muscle within which his secondary hearts beat in slow, thunderous rhythm. Plague light burned from fissures in his bone and from the sockets of his eyes. His staff, driven into the very fabric of the plateau, hummed with barely contained warp energy. The final word left his ravaged throat like a sigh. The Eater of Lives arrived. It did not manifest as a single towering figure, no colossus of flesh and maggots to match the great unclean one that still wrestled with Hierophant titans in some drowning valley. It came as a change in the quality of shadow. Across Hesp, in every stagnant pool and churning plague basin, in every droplet of rain and bead of condensation, awareness flickered. The planet's entire liquid load, from the thin moisture on a plague marine's tongue to the miles-deep sludge seas that had once been oceans, shivered as if something had passed its fingers through them. In the warp, above and alongside reality, a shape the size of a world coiled. The Eater of Lives extended itself, along every molecular pattern it had been given. It leaned into each plague Cole had designed, each viral chain, each bacterial colony, each scrap of fungal thread. It rode the networks that Necrosius had carved across the sky and through the water table. Where droplets touched Tyranid flesh, it tasted them. Where Tyranid blood spilled, it climbed in. The world became, in that moment, less a battlefield and more a body. The plagues were its immune system and its predatory instincts. The Death Guard were no longer merely warriors upon it. They were white corpuscles, malignant but purposeful. Nurgle's favor did not shrink from what that meant. Across the surface, plague marines walked willingly into dissolution. On the walls of Manufactoria temples, they stepped off into pits of writhing sludge, arms spread wide, laughing as their armor came apart around them. In the quagmires where bio-titans and demon engines sank together, they loosened their seals and drank deep, letting the liquid flood their interiors, drowning organs that had survived 100 battles. On the edges of sensor pits, they toppled in by the squad, turning themselves into meat and armor fragments that the Eater of Lives could fold more fully into its network. There was no fear in their voices as they died, only gratitude. To be unmade in service was the purest expression of devotion they understood. Each warrior who burst or sank or dissolved added his corrupted flesh to the great stew, a final tithe of gene-forged meat to the god they had long served. The hive mind's cruelty was of a different flavor. Lotan did not worship, it did not love, it valued. Every organism it had bred for Hesp was a packet of meat and data. Even as seabeds boiled and sky turned to poison, it continued to drive broods into the worst zones, not because it believed they could win ground, but because their deaths would be informative. Gaunts drowned in sludge that ate them as they sank. Rippers that devoured infectious tissue died mid-bite, their bodies losing cohesion as they tried to move. Carnifexes charging through black-green rain had their carapaces slough off in strips, leaving powerful muscles briefly exposed before those too were reduced to hanging ribbons. Every second of agony those creatures endured was recorded. Specialized organ clusters within synapse beasts and bioships took in the chemical stories of those deaths and compressed them. They attempted to extract any shred of useful adjustment, any tweak in enzyme production or cellular defense that might, in another war on another world, grant an incremental advantage. What could not be used as adaptation data was reduced to nutrient. Even in the instant of drowning, a Tyranid organism was plundered. Life juices, altered proteins, partially denatured toxins, all were tasted as they passed through the hive mind's digestion arrays. Nutrient value was assessed, even when the sum came up vanishingly small. There was no reverence for the fallen, no sense of waste in the moral sense. There was only a narrowing of uncountable eyes at the balance sheets. The swarm's advance made less and less sense if measured in territory gained or biomass claimed. It made perfect sense as an act of stubborn, pitiless accounting. It was not enough. In a moment that would be etched, if only as a smear of malformed data, into Lotan's distributed memory, one of its great bioships made a decision. The vessel had circled Hesp for many cycles, its sensing tendrils deep in the cloud layers, its feeding arrays quivering each time plumes of particularly rich fumes brushed their cilia. It had watched as other ships fed more cautiously, extending feeder tubes into carefully selected zones, drawing back when the results proved too volatile. Caution had not yielded victory. It extended a proboscis. The feeder organ thickened as it pushed downward, expanding into something more like a trunk, ridged with peristaltic muscle. It punched through cloud after cloud, leaving holes of momentary clarity that closed behind it. The air around it screamed as it passed, a pressure shock that sent ripples through the already tortured atmosphere. It reached the surface of the greatest sludge ocean and plunged in. For an instant, there was success. The proboscis widened further at its tip, forming a flared mouth that sucked in tons of the planet's fermenting soup. Pumps along its length contracted in rhythmic waves, drawing the world's bile up into the bioship's gut. Then Hesp bit. The mixture it ingested was not merely poison, it was alive in a way that no nutrient should ever be. Plagues riding the slime surged into the feeder organ, following the flow. They clung to the inner lining, burrowing into cells that had never before had to defend against such a coordinated assault. Tyranid enzymes met Nurgle-like pathogens and warp-soaked microbes. For a heartbeat, the two sides wrestled on a purely biochemical level. The Eater of Lives leaned in. The tissues of the proboscis rotted almost instantly. Muscle fibers turned to grey threads and snapped. Support structures softened, unable to bear their own weight. The organ's surface erupted in a rash of rupturing blisters, each one spraying jets of pus and alien ichor into the churning ocean below. The decay raced upward. Within the bioship, alarms that were not alarms in any human sense flared. The vessel convulsed, trying to retract the feeder tube, trying to seal off infected compartments. Autophagus agents were released, specialized cells that could digest their neighbors on command in desperate attempts to cauterize the spreading necrosis. They were too slow. The Eater of Lives had tasted prey that connected directly to the Hive fleet's inner systems. It swam along those paths with obscene joy, riding the currents of the bioship's own circulation. Organs blackened and fell apart. Nerve clusters misfired, sending spasms through living architecture that tore it free of its own supports. Digestive pits boiled as new plagues seeded in their depths, turning what should have been stomachs into exploding bladders of pressurized corruption. From the outside, observers saw the bioship swell. Bloated bulges erupted along its flanks. Its graceful, horrifying lines became distorted, as if something inside were pushing outward in many places at once. Fissures opened along chitin plates, leaking streams of liquid and clouds of gas. Smaller feeder tendrils thrashed, then went limp. Then the ship came apart. It did not detonate in one glorious flare. It tore itself into pieces in stages, each more grotesque than the last. Segments of hull sloughed off and tumbled away, trailing ropes of viscera. Internal organs, some the size of cities, spilled into the void, only to burst themselves and vomit their contents into space. Demons birthed from the overwhelming saturation of warp energy in its dying. Flesh crawled briefly along the wreckage, gibbering before being snatched back into unreality by larger, unseen hands. In the warp, the death scream echoed. Tyranid organisms did not have individual souls. Their presence in that other realm was muted, a diffuse pall more than a chorus of distinct voices. Yet the destruction of a bioship of such magnitude sent a shock through even that low hum. It was as if a vast, droning note had been suddenly spiked with a discordant shriek. Lotan recoiled. For the first time since it had entered the HESP system, the Hive fleet hesitated, not out of calculation, but out of something that, in another, softer species, might have been called revulsion. What it had tasted through that proboscis had not been merely toxic. It had not been a blend of chemicals that could, given enough time and sacrifice, be broken down and repurposed. It had been fundamentally inimical. Wrong in a way that spoke not just to flesh, but to the very idea of flesh. In Wainam, that hesitation lay a victory of the sort the Death Guard had pursued all along. The Great Devourer had been taught that there were worlds whose meat was more than dangerous. There were worlds that were anathema. In a galaxy where worlds are burned without hesitation to deny the Great Devourer its meal, HESP became an inversion of the usual tragedy. Imperial commanders speak with grim reverence of virus bombing and exterminatus, of the hard nobility of turning a living world into ash, rather than see it stripped to bare rock by Tyranid mouths. To the Imperium, refusal is an act of martyrdom. To the Tyranids, refusal is unthinkable. They are hunger given will. They are the principle of consumption made flesh. They do not spare. They do not abstain. They devour. Except, on HESP, they did not. What the Death Guard wrought upon that plague garden pushed the confrontation beyond the usual calculus of biomass and resistance. HESP became something the hive mind could not simply grind, down and swallow at a cost. It became a threat to the fleet's very continuity. Where most wars against the Great Devourer ended with a planet glassed by panicked admirals or gnawed clean by the swarm, this one reached a different conclusion. The Tyranids had to walk away. Hive Fleet Lotan felt the necessity of that choice ripple through its collective awareness in the wake of the bioship's death scream. That great vessel's demise was not a localized loss. Its feeder organ had drunk deeply from Hesp's fermenting sludge, inhaling the blended essence of Nurgle's plagues and the Eater of Live's newly spread consciousness. When its tissues rotted from the inside out, when its organs detonated under the strain of incompatible corruption, the noise of that failure carried through every synaptic strand connected to it. Within the Gestalt, nodes of awareness paused. Analysis spiraled outward from the bioship's corrupted remains. Data streams that should have integrated cleanly into Lotan's distributed genome faltered and crashed, their contents riddled with contradictions and impossible structures. Attempts to parse those patterns as useful adaptation material returned nothing but warning flags. Sections of enzymatic code refused to stabilize. New proteins folded into shapes that dragged the machinery of creation down with them, pulling whole processes into chemical madness. It was as if the bioship's dying taste of Hesp had introduced noise not only into its own flesh, but into the language the Hive fleet used to describe flesh. Lotan reacted with a swiftness that would have shocked any human tactician, expecting mindless hunger. The synaptic node that had governed that bioship and its associated broods was quarantined in an instant. Thought paths that fed into and out of it were cut, trimmed back to clean tissue. Signal sacs that had once pulsed with coordination orders flattened, their contents kept from release. The patterns that defined that portion of the fleet's identity were cordoned off like infected organs in a surgical theatre. Classification followed. Hesp ceased to be a world rich in biomass weighed against a high defensive cost. It became a hazard marker in the hive mind's internal maps, a blank spot wreathed in warning cues. No further feeder tendrils were permitted to extend into its atmosphere. Those already unfurled recoiled, sealing their mouths, sloughing their outermost layers in an effort to leave contaminated cells behind. Retraction orders cascaded down through ranks of organisms that had never heard the concept of retreat. Bioforms engaged at the fringes of the worst plague zones were pulled back by synaptic command, turned away from the thickest stew of toxins and warp taint. Broods were herded toward extraction points where they might be fed into less lethal digestion pits and then recycled into forms more suited to other wars. But severance alone would not be enough. The wounded bioship was a tumor within the fleet, a mass of meat that contained information and substance. The hive mind could not risk allowing to persist. Its tissue held not just the memory of Hesp's taste, but the Eater of Live's fingerprints, Nurgle's cackling signature impressed on every molecule. If those patterns were allowed to linger, even in death, they might leach into the broader genome, might infect future adaptations with their insanity. The surrounding vessels turned their weapons inward. From the flanks of still stable bioships, living artillery extruded and flexed. Cannon symbiotes redirected their aims from the boiling world below to the bloated, collapsing hulk that drifted among them. Bioplasma sacs expanded, their internal pressures rising to screaming levels as corrosive energy built. The volley that followed was not fired in anger. Tyranids did not feel anger. It was fired in the same cold spirit as a surgeon amputating a limb infected beyond saving. Streams of incandescent bioplasma lanced through the void, crossing the short distances between vessels in heartbeats. They struck the dead and dying bioship with enough force to tear new craters in its already ruptured flanks. What little coherent structure remained inside burned. Organs vaporized, leaving voids that collapsing hull could not support. Gland forests, twisted beyond recognition by the Eater of Live's caress, were reduced to drifting clouds of ash. Secondary explosions rippled through the carcass as pressurized sacs burst and digestion pools flashed to steam. Hull plates, those great cathedral buttresses of chitin and bone, blew outward in long, spinning fragments. Some collided with the firing ships and glanced off, leaving streaks of dissolving matter in their wake that had to be cauterized by yet more plasma fire. Others tumbled away into the wider system, already cooling toward dead lumps by the time they left the immediate sphere of conflict. When only a skeletal framework of charred, twisted organic architecture remained, the fleet fired again. And again. They burned the bioship down to its component particles. They did not permit a single recognizable configuration of its tainted tissue to survive. In doing so, they sacrificed an amount of stored energy and potential that would have fed uncounted millions of lesser organisms. The loss registered in Lotan's mindful hunger as a tightening, a narrowing of options. It was still preferable to the alternative. Below, the last scenes on Hesp played out in a world that no longer cared which side had come from where. One Lord of Contagion, nameless now in the eyes of any record keeper who did not dwell in Nurgle's garden, hauled himself through a sludge field that had once been a manufactoria plaza. His cataphracti warplate, once a juggernaut of layered ceramite and barrel-like pauldrons, had been reduced to a cracked shell. Plates hung from him by strands of meat and rusted cabling. The great blight axe in his hand trailed behind him, its enormous blade buried in the mire, dredging up strings of rotten matter with every dragging step. His legs were gone from the knee down. In their place, the sludge itself seemed to grip his ruined femurs, forming temporary supports that tore and reformed as he moved. Inside his chest, what lungs he still possessed were barely functioning, more sieve than organ. Each breath heaved a slurry of pus and liquefied tissue up his throat, flooding his vox grill before spilling out over what remained of his breastplate. He dragged himself onto a slight rise, a hummock of congealed bone and armor fragments. From that vantage, such as it was, he could see very little. Visibility had shrunk to a handful of meters in any direction, a fog of vapor and spore and boiling miasma, turning the world into a close yellow-grey box. Shapes moved within it, some low and scuttling, some towering and uncertain. The sounds of battle had become a constant, background roar, indistinct and unmoved. He knew, without needing to see, that most of those sounds no longer came from his brothers. There were no vox orders in his ears. The Death Guard channels that had once thrummed with wet laughter, muttered invocations, and the rattle of armor were silent. He was alone, but this was a loneliness that did not dismay him. Nurgle was everywhere in the soup around him. His god's presence pressed in on him as heavily as the atmosphere. He tried to kneel. One knee folded, armor cracking and sliding aside, fat and foulness spilling out. The other did not have the integrity to follow. He ended up half collapsed, weight borne mostly by his left arm and the haft of his axe. The ground squelched and hissed under his mass, greedily absorbing every fragment that sloughed off him. "Grandfather," he gargled, voice barely audible even to his own damaged ears. "I return, a little late, but richer." His helm's interior flooded as he spoke, mouth filling with his own disintegration. He did not attempt another word. Instead, he let go of the haft of his weapon and spread his arms as far as the fused and warped joints of his shoulder plates would allow. His chest collapsed inward. The skin of his torso, such as it was, split along lines that had been forming ever since Cole's apex plagues, and Necrosius's rituals had met within his corrupted flesh. Bones softened, then snapped, ribs folding like softened wax under a heavy thumb. He sank slowly, armor fragments and gristle and half-dissolved organs slipping free of all structure. The sludge closed over his helm with a hungry suck, leaving only a slowly widening ring of slightly paler muck to mark where he had been. He died as he had lived since his fall, submerged in rot and faith, another vector willingly unmade. Across the world, other final moments echoed his. Individual plague marines, nameless poxwalker herds, demon engines too entangled in the sludge. To extract themselves, all went still in different ways. Some vanished without drama, pulled under by the sheer weight of accumulated ruin. Others chose more theatrical exits, detonating their remaining munitions or slicing their own armor open to spill their cargo of carefully nurtured plagues into the nearest available hole. Above, Lotan's last ground assaults faltered, then ceased. The hive mind drew back its gaze. It did not do so in defeat, for it did not acknowledge such concepts. It simply wrote a new rule, that Hesp was not to be eaten. The world became a void in its projected feeding paths, a hole around which future tendrils would bend. The synaptic maps that guided its splinter fleets showed the Hesp system as a blank, not because nothing was there, but because what was there could not be permitted to touch them. In that, perhaps, there was the only meaningful sense in which the Death Guard's strategy had worked. No one won Hesp. The forces committed to the world, the forces, by the 4th and 7th Plague Companies were gone. Their sepsis cohorts, their Vectoriums, their engines and manufactoria, their carefully nurtured plague strains that had not been folded into the planet's new unified infection, all were lost as discrete tools. The commanders who had walked its surface with such confidence were either dissolved into its cauldron or withdrawn, their influence now expressed only through the lingering architectures of ritual and disease. Hive Fleet Lotan had paid its own price. Swarms beyond counting drowned in the slop. Specialist organisms that had taken precious cycles to grow died choking on plagues they could not metabolize. One bioship, and with it, a rich complexity of organs and genetic libraries, had been not merely destroyed, but anathematized and burned from the fleet's living record. Hesp herself was no longer a resource to any sane power. Its atmosphere was a weapon without a wielder. Its oceans were seething grave pits. Its crust was softened and shot through with rotten veins. No fortress could be built there, no harvest grown, no reinforcements marshaled. It was a corpse that refused to decay into anything clean. Yet, in the shadowed gardens of Nurgle, the world was perfect. From the Plague God's vantage, Hesp was a planet-sized pot left to simmer. The Eater of Lives awareness flowed across it, tasting subtle shifts in its broth. New microbial configurations rose to prominence and fell again, their brief dominances bright sparks in an endless bubbling tapestry. Toxic storms circled without end, lightning sketching warped constellations across a sky that would never again be clear. The god of rot did not require strategy. He required only that things change and break and be remade in worse, more interesting forms. Hesp's stasis as a plague garden was not the stillness of a frozen corpse, but the constant, tiny motion of maggots in a wound. For him, it was ideal. For Lotan, it was a blind spot, a scar, in the great maps written into its being. Somewhere in the wide volume of space through which the Hive Fleet's tendrils travelled, there were traces that did not entirely fade. A few broods had withdrawn from Hesp's fringes before the apex plagues had fully saturated their bodies. A handful of organisms had licked only the edge of that poisoned well. There were enzymes in them now that did not behave entirely as expected. There were sequences in their molecular code that bore faint echoes of Nurglite design, loops that might express themselves only under very particular stresses. In the aeons to come, perhaps, those tiny ghosts in Lotan's genome would stir. Perhaps, in some distant war where hunger and resistance reached a different kind of stalemate, a fragment of Hesp's lesson would twitch in the heart of a new organism and send it veering from its original purpose. Or perhaps not. The galaxy is too large, and its horrors too many, for certainty, when word of Hesp, filtered, heavily degraded and incomplete, back to the Imperium, it did not come in the form of detailed reports or clean data. It came as astropathic fragments, as garbled vox logs recovered from plague-blurred broadcasts, as half-formed visions in the minds of those unfortunate enough to skim the edges of the great rift storms near that sector. Imperial cartographers, hunched over star charts in vaults far from the actual stink of the world, made their notations. Hesp was marked as lost. More than that, it was annotated as a toxic anomaly, a place whose atmosphere and biosphere had been so thoroughly corrupted that even the most desperate crusade should consider it beyond reclamation. Marginalia scrawled in the margins of those charts by faceless adepts used phrases like "no known faction in control" and "warp interference extreme," and "avoid unless absolute necessity." No one in those rooms had seen the bubbling seas. None of them had smelled the air or heard the laughter of plague marines sinking beneath it. They lacked the imagination to truly grasp what a void meant in this context. But they marked it all the same, and those marks would guide voyages for generations. As for the wretched and the chosen sons, they endured. Plague companies do not die in the way mortal regiments die. So long as Mortarion brooded upon his black peaks, so long as Nurgle chuckled in his fetid mansion, the 4th and 7th would exist as ideas given flesh. Their banners would be raised again in other systems. Their sepsis cohorts would trudge through new slurries. Their sorcerers and chemlords would find fresh worlds to experiment upon. The specific brothers who had walked Hesp's sinking bones, however, were gone. Their names, where they had persisted at all, were now whispered only by the flies that crawled along the rims of the planet's plague basins. Their gene-crafted bodies had been reduced to sludge and incorporated into the Eater of Lives' body. Their deeds had become indistinguishable from the general weight of suffering that gave Nurgle his jollity. The tally of diseases had grown longer, the tally of warriors had grown shorter. For the Death Guard, that was a fair exchange. In the age of the Great Rift, wars like the devouring of Hesp do not end with banners raised over broken walls or with triumphant declarations from marble balconies. They end in silence and spoilage. They end with planets transformed into examples, warnings, and raw scars on reality. There are no heroes, only corpses arranged in different patterns. Hesp's legacy was not a reclaimed sector or a new front line. It was a lesson written in rot. The Death Guard had been cruel enough, patient enough, and thorough enough to ruin even the appetite of the galaxy's purest hunger. They had taken an entire world, and rather than merely killing it, had cooked it into a dish so corrupt that even the Great Devourer dared not take a second bite.